The Pope criticized Trump's immigration policy. He called the deportations a humanitarian crisis. Then he criticized the Iran war, called it unacceptable. Then he criticized the treatment of civilians, called it a moral failure. But here is what hasn't happened. The Pope has not once said Trump did something right, not once said a policy was good, not once offered anything that looked like approval. And at some point that pattern becomes its own question. Is the Pope just watching everything Trump does and finding nothing, not one thing worth acknowledging, or is something else going on? Why does the Pope only criticize? Where is the other side of the ledger? Most people land on the same reading pretty quickly. The Pope is progressive. He cares about immigration, about the poor, about climate change. Trump sits on the opposite end of almost every one of those issues. Different values, different priorities, different worldview. So when the Pope looks at what Trump is doing, of course all he sees is problems. The criticism isn't coming from a neutral place, it's coming from a particular set of values that happen to be in direct conflict with this particular administration. It's not that the Pope can't praise, it's that there's nothing in front of him that matches what he believes is right. The lens he's looking through filters out the parts that might otherwise look good. So the conclusion feels natural. The Pope criticizes Trump because the Pope disagrees with Trump. Personality, values, worldview, it's a mismatch, not a pattern. Except there's a problem with that explanation. Trump's relationship with Iran didn't start as a war. There was a moment before the strikes, before the escalation, where Trump was signaling he wanted a deal. A negotiated solution, no military action. The Pope, whose entire public position on Iran has been to oppose military force, had a direct opening to say, this is the right instinct, pursue it. He didn't. When Trump pulled back from a strike earlier in his presidency and chose a diplomatic path, the Pope said nothing that acknowledged it. When Trump stated publicly that he wanted to avoid a ground war, the Pope's office released nothing that recognized the alignment. And then there's this, the Pope himself said he hopes Trump finds an exit from the conflict. That sentence is one step away from acknowledgement, but it never became acknowledgement. So the values explanation starts to loosen, because the moments were there. The alignment existed, at least partially, at least temporarily. A purely values-driven critic would have taken those openings. The Pope didn't take them. If it's just a values mismatch, why did the values line up sometimes and the praise still never come? So let's try a different angle. What if it's not about values at all? What if the Pope isn't looking at Trump's actions and finding them wrong, but looking at what happens to himself the moment he says they're right? What if praising Trump isn't something the Pope avoids because of what Trump did, but because of what praising does to the Pope? Think about what changes the moment the Pope says, this policy is good, this decision was right, this man made the correct call. Who does the Pope become in that moment? What does he look like to the other side of that statement? And what happens to every criticism he makes after that? The question isn't what Trump deserves. The question is what a single moment of praise costs the person giving it from that specific position with that specific weight behind the words. Not a values filter, but a cost calculation. Start with where he's standing. The Pope is the moral reference point for 1.4 billion Catholics. Not a commentator, not an activist, not a political ally, a reference point. The moment he praises a specific political figure, he doesn't just express an opinion, he moves. He steps off the center and onto a side. And a reference point that has moved to one side is no longer a reference point. It's a participant. A referee who cheers for one team doesn't become a better referee, he stops being a referee entirely. Now think about what happens to the criticism. The Pope's criticism lands the way it does because it comes from someone who hasn't endorsed anyone. That's what gives it the weight it has. It reads as a moral verdict, not a political attack. But the moment the Pope has praised Trump once, every criticism that follows gets reread, not as a moral judgment, as a political move. As the other side of a preference that has already been revealed. The scale only works as a scale when both sides are empty. The moment you put weight on one side, it stops measuring and starts showing which way you lean. Now think about what the praise would actually cost. If the Pope praises Trump, the half of the world that opposes Trump doesn't just disagree with the Pope, they stop listening to him, not on Trump, on everything. The moral authority that took centuries to build gets tied to one administration, one term, one set of decisions that will eventually end. And when that administration ends, and all administrations end, the authority doesn't come back clean. It comes back marked. A judge who ruled in favor of one side doesn't become neutral again just because the case is closed. Neutrality is not the same as silence. Sometimes the only way to stay in the center is to never step toward either side, not even once, not even when one step feels justified, not even when the other side genuinely deserves it. The Pope doesn't avoid praise because he has nothing good to say. He avoids it because praise from that position isn't just a compliment, it's a relocation, and once you've relocated, the place you left doesn't hold your spot. Not praising is how you stay in the position where your criticism means something. So back to the original question, the Pope criticizes Trump's immigration policy, he criticizes the Iran war, he criticizes the treatment of civilians, and he has never once offered anything that looked like approval. And the question was, does the Pope just hate Trump? Is this bias dressed up as moral authority? Here is the reframe. The criticism is not the bias, the criticism is the job. The moment the Pope steps into praise of Trump, of anyone, of any specific political decision, he doesn't become more balanced. He becomes less Pope. He trades the position that makes his words land for the temporary satisfaction of acknowledging something good. And once that trade is made, it can't be unmade. We looked at the one-sided ledger and saw hatred. That was the wrong frame. From where he stands, the one-sided ledger is the only way the ledger works at all. The criticism isn't evidence that he hates Trump. It's evidence that he's still standing in the place where what he says about Trump or anyone actually means something. Biased people criticize one side, but people in certain positions can't afford to praise either side. Those two things look identical from the outside, they are completely different from the inside.